According to Maine's Office of Tourism, fall visitors contributed nearly $2 billion to the state's economy, and fall foliage is a big draw for many of those visitors. But climate change is changing foliage this season. News Center Maine's Christian Harsa has more on what that means for the communities that rely on leaf peepers and the money they bring.
Fall foliage has been delayed about a decade since the 1950s.
Dr. Stephanie Spera moved from her hometown of Massachusetts to Virginia in order to work at the University of Richmond. And as an autumn lover, a question on her mind was,
how do I get back here in my favorite season?
And she made it back to New England to research the effects of climate change on the timing of peak fall foliage in Acadia National Park. Spera's findings revealed that 70 years ago on Mount Desert Island, fall colors would peak at the beginning of October.
But now it's happening on average the 15th and the 16th. And over the last 20 years in particular, actually the timing's gotten a lot more unpredictable.
She and her team used satellite imaging, old scrapbook photos, and foliage reports to piece together the region's autumn color history. But peak foliage isn't necessarily one thing. Rather, Maine Forest Service Director of Forest Policy Morton Mosswild says defining peak color is subjective.
It's a question of gauging, what are they likely to see? What's the weather doing? How bright are the colors? Which species are turning?
But to determine when to produce less green pigment, trees use two cues, daylight and temperature, and specifically nighttime temperature, which Spera says is changing.
It's really interesting just climatologically that nights are warming faster than, the lows are getting higher more quickly than the highs are getting higher.
She says over the last 20 years, fall foliage has occurred later, but is becoming more unpredictable because of the weather.
Precipitation is getting more erratic. Instead of having rainfall, you're like, oh, we get a few inches a month. You'll have months without rain, months with tons of rain.
Unpredictability makes fall vacation plans harder to time perfectly. In 2019, Spera says her survey showed that Acadia visitors plan their trips 1 to 3 months in advance.
And now they're doing it 6 months to a year. And it's interesting because they have to hedge their bets on when they think the fall foliage is going to be peak.
And more people are visiting Acadia in the fall, says the park's public affairs officer, Amanda Pollock.
Indigenous Peoples Day weekend was probably one of the busiest weekends the park has ever seen.
Which was when this year's foliage report says Acadia was at peak. But 30 years from now, the perfect peak weekend will be the end of October, according to Spera's data.
So if we continue to warm on the track that we are, and that's what the trees are responding to, is primarily temperature, it's only going to get later and later.
Which she feels could put strain not just on Acadia, but other national parks.
We really have to think about what that means for the communities in and around these towns, these national parks, and the businesses there and park management.
When it comes to confronting Acadia's changing climate, the Park Service has the RAD framework, standing for Resist, Adapt, and Direct.
And that is a tool that helps managers try and make these really hard decisions when we're in such a time of rapid change.
Resisting could be building a bigger and better trail resistant to erosion, while adapting might be moving a trail from the seaside to further away in anticipation of more storm damage. And Direct is more about preparing the landscape for the changing future, something the park is attempting on Cadillac Summit.
We are currently doing some work to try and experiment with different hybrid native species that are better able to adapt.
Spera is expanding her research to national parks and forests across the Northeast to better understand how climate change is impacting woodlands across the region. Christian Harsa, News Center, Maine.